when you open the door for somebody else.
Welcome, everybody, back into the vaccine conversation.
Not just in, but back and in.
Yes, I just thought I'd get it all in there, but in a different order. I like mixing it up.
In case you were front, now you're back. In case you were out, now you're in. We got it. Welcome to our chat table. Yes. On the vaccine conversation.
Well, we were back with a very interesting topic today. I kind of feel like
who brought this topic to you?
This is another one of Melissa's fascinating ideas that I would have never thought of. All right.
I don't even remember how I came across this particular study. Oh, I know how I did. I was researching encephalitis and reports of encephalitis with the MMR vaccine. Or with measles vaccine. And then it led me to this study, which was done in 2014 called...
I should probably read the study since it's a scientific
Okay, well, I can at least give the name since I'm just a mom. Okay. Here's the title of the study, A Review of Factors Affecting Vaccine-Preventable Disease in Japan. And this study goes on to talk not just about the measles vaccine, but kind of the overview of the vaccine program. And I should note, this is 2014. There have been a lot of changes since then, and we'll talk about later maybe why we think that's happened. But I want to just imagine we're still in 2014 as we talk about this, because the way that they approach their vaccine program is totally different than the way we approach ours. And when there are side effects happening, there's an immediate stop on that vaccine until they figure things out.
Right.
And then they would reinitiate and they would change things. It's a very different than our schedule and the way that we do things here. So what did you need to do, Dr. Lee?
Oh, no, I was going to just kind of, read the title of the study of the doctors and the reference.
How about you read their names?
But I mean, if you go on, Scholar Google and type in the title of the study, you can kind of pull it up for yourself if you want. And it's from the Hawaii Journal of Medicine and Public Health, December 2014.
Almost 2015.
Yeah. So I want to read the abstract, I guess, just because I think it gives kind of a good overall summary. It basically says, Japan is well known as a country with a strong health record. However, its incident rates of vaccine-preventable diseases, such as hepatitis B, measles, mumps, rubella, and varicella, remain higher than other developed countries. This article reviews the factors that contribute to the high rates of these diseases in Japan. These include historical and political factors that delayed the introduction of several important vaccines until recently. Access has also been affected by vaccines being divided into government-funded routine vaccines, like pertussis and polio, and self-pay voluntary vaccines like hepatitis A and B. Routine vaccines have higher rates of administration than the voluntary vaccines. Administration factors include differences in child care schedules, the approach to simultaneous vaccination contraindication due to fever, and vaccination spacing. Parental factors include low intention to fully vaccinate their children and misperceptions about side effects and efficacy. There are also provider knowledge gaps regarding indications, adverse effects, interval, and simultaneous vaccination. These multifactorial issues combine to produce lower population immunization rates and a higher incidence of vaccine-preventable diseases than other developed countries. This article will provide insight into the current situation of Japanese vaccinations, the issues to be addressed, and suggestions for the public health promotion.
And the thing that stands out to me here is, they always throw misperceptions about side effects, right? It's always a misperception. If you have a question about side effects, it's a misperception. Right. It's misinformation, right? But what they're saying is that there are higher incidence of these diseases. They're not saying that's leading to higher mortality for these diseases. And what you originally told me a while ago is vaccines, their goal with the CDC is to reduce incidence of disease. Even if that disease is not detrimental to you or necessarily harmful to you, they're just trying to decrease the numbers. And by you reading that abstract, it really sounds like Japan has higher numbers here. We've got to get those down. And the reason that people aren't doing it is because only half of them are mandatory, half are voluntary. And the ones, you have a higher chance of getting compliance with the mandatory ones. So therefore, we should do more that are mandatory if we want to get these numbers down. But then what it goes to say in the introduction, which is key, Japan ranks among the world's leaders in the health of its citizens. The Japanese have the longest life expectancy and number of years lived in full health. That's important.
Right.
Not just years lived in full health. It says Japan is among the leaders in the developed world in low obesity rates, low infant and cardiovascular disease mortality. The World Health Organization ranked Japan first in overall health and the health goal attainment among 191 countries in its most recent rankings. Japan is the leader in low mortality rates for certain things. It is overall health goal. It is the number one country out of 191 countries. It's one of the world leaders in health, and yet it has higher levels of vaccine preventable diseases than other countries.
Right.
They don't have to go together as if you have the infection, it means death.
Right.
It doesn't have to mean death. And this is a perfect example of how it doesn't.
Right. And what kind of confounds me is I feel like any reasonable scientist, the first thing they would do when they read that Japan ranks the highest among developed countries is among the leaders, they should stop to try to think why.
Why? Mm-hmm.
And why, if they have the lowest vaccination rates virtually among all these countries, but they have the higher health rates, why could that be? Why would there be two variables that seem at odds with each other? And that should challenge them. That should challenge any reasonable scientist.
Because it says in stark contrast to all of these positive health indicators.
They have all these diseases.
They have high rates of, but not just any disease, vaccine preventable diseases. Those are the ones they're worried about.
You're right. They don't have higher rates of other diseases. They're just tracking or talking about the vaccine preventable diseases.
Right. And maybe there are other diseases, but they don't have a vaccine for them, so they don't really care about those. But because they do have vaccines, they care about the fact that people are not getting vaccinated more frequently.
Right. And I want to read some data from CNN that kind of adds to this. So there's basically a CNN article online, and they have a table that says where infant mortality is above or below average, and they basically looked at all the wealthiest countries from all over the world, and they looked at they kind of got the average of the 20 wealthiest countries. And they saw where their infant mortality, just the first year of life, they ranked where they were either below average or higher than average. And higher than average means worse. Obviously a higher than average infant mortality.
More children are dying per 1,000 live births.
Right. So Iceland was number one for infant mortality. They were 43% below average. Japan was number two. They're 30% lower infant mortality than all these other countries.
Than the average of the other 19 countries.
United States was 75% above, higher than average infant mortality. And they're ranked the very bottom, like the lowest in infant mortality of all these countries they were ranked. So again, Japan is 30% better in infant mortality, and the United States is 75% worse. Now, when we look at child mortality, this is all now kids going from 1 to age 19. So these are now kids that are in Japan are catching the vaccine preventable diseases and living through them and growing up. Where does Japan rank with children? They are 14% better than average or below average child mortality. And the United States is 47% higher child mortality and ranked the very bottom of this as well. And so Japan is third in child mortality. They are second in infant mortality. But this article we just read ranked them first in overall adult mortality.
What is the United States in child mortality?
In child, the second from the bottom.
Yeah. So they're the bottom in one, and then they're second from the bottom in the other.
Right. So that's very telling that the United States pretty much is the highest vaccinating country. There's no other countries that give more vaccines than we do, and we're ranked the lowest. And then we'll
do a separate episode on infant mortality rate and global vaccine rates, because that's a whole other topic.
But I feel like every scientists, they're completely missing the most important hypothesis that someone could put forth. and say, why would a country be so healthy and yet have such low vaccination rates or have such a small vaccination schedule? Their solution is, how do we fix that by raising their vaccination schedule? That's the whole goal of this article.
They're missing the point.
Yeah, why does Japan vaccinate so much less than the rest of us, and how can we fix it? Because that's got to make Japan healthier.
Right, and they say, why are VPDs so common in Japan? Yeah. It says, Japan is among the wealthiest countries in the world, has universal health care, and has access to the same vaccines as other developed countries. So why are these diseases so common? And yet, it goes back to, we're still world leader in health, the leaders in the developed world with cardiovascular mortality, as far as the lowest, and ranked number one with the World Health Organization. So it doesn't really sound like there's a problem. I mean, if you're World Health Organization number one, what's better than that? As far as your overall health, why are you making adjustments? And as we've seen, the adjustments they've made between the time this was written and now, I saw the infant mortality rate, actually, they went down to number 3 instead of number 2 in the last year's report from the OECD.
Okay, all right.
They've already dropped now with the increase in vaccines as we've seen in their schedule.
Right. So I think the first thing they talk about with Japan and why this, why they vaccinate less is there's a lot of historical context to this. And for me, kind of the most telling historical event that happened was back in the 1970s. Two infants died right away after getting the whole cell pertussis vaccine. I think the vaccine had recently become licensed, right? About 4 years earlier. And 2 infants died within 24 hours of getting that vaccine. You know what the Japanese government did? They suspended the vaccine. They actually took immediate action, said 2 infants just died. They suspended it because we need to investigate this.
For only 2 infants.
Right, for only 2 infants
The
dying.
entire nation program stopped giving this vaccine for 2 months.
You would never see that in America.
Never.
You never see that. And then what they did is they reinstated the vaccine 2 months later, but they changed the age at which you give the vaccine. It used to be 3 months of age, and that these young infants died when they got the vaccine so young. They changed it to give the vaccine at 2 years of age.
I mean, think about that. That is crazy. That would never happen here. So they thought this could be potentially dangerous to infants. So we are going to stop giving it to infants, and we are going to up the age to where the immune system is a little bit stronger. The baby might be able to handle a dose. 2 years old is, again, by the time we would have already had 30-some doses here. And this is considered one of the necessary vaccines, too. Diphtheria and tetanus and pertussis.
Right.
And so they're pushing that. They pushed that not just a month, not 2 months, not 3 months. And they didn't add extra doses. And they actually skipped them all until 2 years old. That is just
2 years. Yeah,
that's
just
amazing.
The
this is in 1974.
Yeah, DTP whole cell vaccine. So then, rates of pertussis or whooping cough increased because they stopped giving the vaccine to all babies. Pertussis increased, and they started to have fatalities from the disease again, and they actually had 41 fatalities in 1979.
And that's out of 13,000 cases.
Right. And so but it's interesting that they looked at the idea that an intervention was causing death. So we're going to stop that intervention. And then even though the lack of intervention is now allowing some deaths, I don't know if they consider just the deaths from pertussis were basically from the natural course of life and infections that we can't always prevent. And they were allowing some deaths because they were unwilling to reinstate
the whole cell,
like a direct medical treatment that they knew was then going to cause fatalities.
Well, they waited.
Allowed the natural fatalities to happen.
They waited till 1981 to do the acellular,
right? Which
was having less adverse reactions,
right.
And so
it's interesting. So Japan was the first country to develop the acellular vaccine. Why? Because they were looking for a solution. In the United States, we just kept using the whole cell vaccine, killing
Still at 3
babies
months.
left and right, causing all kinds of brain injury, 2 months of age.
Yeah, 2 months.
And we just kept using it. Japan took a very different approach. They stopped using it, where they were accepting fatalities from the disease. They worked hard to develop a vaccine that would not cause such a high rate of brain injury. and they developed the acellular vaccine, and they reinstituted it. And then in the subsequent decade, the incidence of pertussis fell way back down again, and they didn't have the fatalities from the disease they were having. And so it's like they worked hard to find a solution that in America didn't happen until much later. We didn't adopt the acellular until the mid-90s.
Yeah. And we were still doing 2 months, 4 months, 6 months.
Yeah.
What I found interesting with a lot of these other countries is they do their DTaP at 3 months, 5 months, and 12 months, or 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. So they're getting the same 3 doses, but in a year's time instead of all in the first 6 months. And we've had that aggressive schedule for a very long time, even with the whole cell.
Yeah.
And Japan wasn't doing that. They had it more spread out so that there was more time.
So the next historical event that I'm actually kind of a little more aware of this because I read about this before was in 1987, Japan started using the full MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. Well, shortly after that, the mumps part of the MMR vaccine was linked to causing aseptic meningitis. And this happened all over the world. Mm-hmm. This happened in Britain. This happened I think in the United States as well. The strain of mumps they were using to make the vaccine, they couldn't neutralize the strain well enough. And the strain was causing active infections in people's brains. It was causing meningitis. And you can, if you do a literature search on meningitis, side effects from mumps vaccine, you'll see this historically. There are many cases in the literature, and they decided there's something wrong with the mumps vaccine. So what did Japan do? Let's see. They discontinued the use of the combination MMR vaccine and started using separate measles, separate mumps, separate rubella vaccines. They made the mumps vaccine out of a new strain that would not cause meningitis. They started giving them separately. And this also happened worldwide. They started making the MMR worldwide with a new strain of mumps, so it would not cause that high rate of encephalitis.
And to this day, mumps is an optional vaccine for Japan.
Right, exactly.
Even to this day in 2018.
They never reinstated the use of mumps vaccine as a required vaccine. And it's interesting that this whole thing caused significant public scrutiny of all vaccinations, and it actually swayed the prevailing political attitude towards a more cautious approach.
Seems like makes total normal sense.
Right, yeah, but you would never see the United States adopt a more cautious approach.
They don't use the MMR vaccine in Japan. They use a measles and rubella vaccine, and then again, the mumps part is optional. And that's still to this day, even with everybody saying the MMR vaccine is completely safe and effective, they still haven't reintroduced that to their schedule.
And then I love this in 1994, pressure by citizens and by medical professionals, which is crazy, led them to change the law to make vaccination an individual responsibility and an option instead of a mandatory law.
Okay, so let's look at this. It says, in addition to the pertussis and MMR events, the Japanese government was sued several times in the 80s and 90s because of vaccine adverse events. And so what did they do? Because of the pressure from citizens and from doctors who agreed. Doctors were on the side of the patients. That led them to modify in 1994 to change it so that it was an individual responsibility instead of mandatory. But what happened in the United States? Lawsuits in the 70s and the 80s, and that turned into instead denying the parents who had children that had vaccine injuries, ignoring them, and making a law that removed liability for the vaccine manufacturers. So they literally did the opposite thing that we did because they responded to it in a way that normal people would respond to it. It was about their citizens. It was about protecting people, not about protecting the bottom line of pharmaceutical companies. They just did not have that same kind of influence that the United States pharmaceutical companies had.
So then the second issue as to why they say, they vaccinate so differently in Japan was that Japan adopts new vaccines under their schedule at a much, much slower rate than most modern countries. And it's interesting, they say between 1993 and 2007, there was a vaccine gap. Only 2 new vaccines were brought to the Japanese market. one was hepatitis A, and one was a combined measles and rubella vaccine. Only 2 new vaccines. In fact, the measles and rubella weren't even a new vaccine. It was just the fact that it was
new
combined.
for them.
So really the only new one they introduced between 93 and 07 was hepatitis A. In contrast, 17 new vaccines were introduced over that same time in the United States.
I know, I have that part circled. So think about that. In 14 years, there were only 2 vaccines introduced, and in the same time period, there were 17 new vaccines. The irony is that this study is trying to make it seem like, do you see we're falling behind?
Right.
But really what it's doing is it's showing us an example of how vaccination policies should work and how medical professionals and the public can be on the same team to create the vaccines that are most necessary, create the vaccines as limited doses as we need to get the job done. And then when there are problems, they listen to people and they make adjustments. We don't make adjustments here. The only adjustments we make are adding vaccines instead of removing them or reassessing. And this is why I use that hashtag time to reassess on some of my posts, because I think the vaccine schedule needs to be reassessed.
Yeah, then for me, the next interesting event was when the Japanese government suspended the Hib and the pneumococcal vaccines. Those are infant meningitis vaccines. They suspended them in 2011 because there were 7 deaths of children right after the vaccines. They suspended use of those 2 vaccines. Now, they only suspended the use for a month, and they reinstated them quickly, but only after they investigated the 7 deaths and were found that these deaths were unrelated to the vaccines. Now, you could argue, how could they determine that? I mean, what if 1 or 2 or 3 of those deaths were related to those vaccines? But just the fact that the government would suspend the vaccines for a month and investigate.
Suspend first, investigate after.
It speaks a lot about the Japanese government and how they approach this.
And they talk about the HPV vaccine, where they say this was put into the market, is added April 2013, so 7 years later than what we had on the United States schedule. But only after 2 months of becoming available in Japan, the government ordered to cease active promotion of this vaccine because of fears of complex regional pain syndrome. And the HPV vaccine is under further investigation. This is in 2014 when they wrote this article. It's under further investigation, and it may be withdrawn from the market despite ongoing use in the United States and other countries. Right. And we know that there are lawsuits that are happening currently.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there are large groups of Japanese citizens that are suing the Japanese government over injuries from this vaccine. So they call it complex regional pain syndrome. And we're also hearing worldwide of this very strange, complicated neurological conditions that are coming on, in higher rates, and especially women who are getting the HPV vaccine. So it's fascinating to me that Japan suspended it. Now, let me give you a little update of what's happened. Let's see. So what'd they do? Did they suspend it? Is that what you read?
It was suspended at that point.
Government ordered providers to cease. No, they provided to cease active promotion.
Yes, but it said it might be withdrawn from the market.
So what happened is, since then, the government has allowed the vaccine to continue to be used, but they're not putting it on their recommended vaccine schedule. They're basically leaving it on there as optional. So people are allowed to give it in Japan, but the government is not advising anyone gets it. They're just saying it's optional, and so parents can kind of make their own decision on this.
And so one of the things I thought was so interesting, and I know we've had a lot of concern about this here, it says the Japanese approach to vaccination in children with mild fevers, the way this study says, contributes to missed opportunities for vaccines because the Japanese immunization vaccination law, there's a law, does not allow vaccination if patients have a body temperature more than 37.5 degrees Celsius, which is 99.5. If the child has a temperature of 99.5 degrees, according to the law, you are not allowed to vaccinate that child.
Interesting.
And it says this is in contrast with the recommended practice of the United States where there is no specific threshold for body temperature. How many times have we heard stories, somebody being sick, somebody already coming in with a fever and being vaccinated and causing exacerbated problems as a result of being vaccinated while the body was already in a heightened immune response. This is not just a recommendation, you guys. This was their law. They have an immunization vaccination law, laws that tell you the way that you need to vaccinate to be most cautious. Like you said, it's a cautious approach. And it just makes sense to me. As I'm reading this, I'm thinking these are all the things that they should be doing. But then what do they say? Well, if you delay the vaccination because of the fever, you might miss the vaccination. So this is why our schedule for the United States, they're so worried about people missing vaccinations that they're clumping them all together because they don't think the parent's going to come back. They're putting 8 and 9 doses together because of convenience to get compliance, not because it's safe, not because it's better. In fact, everything I keep reading about the measles vaccine talks about 15 months and later being the age that you're supposed to create enough antibodies, and that when you do it at 12 months, it does not create the same level of antibodies response, which means it's not as effective. And yet you're having people do it earlier because you're already there for 12 months for something else. Let's just throw it into the mix. But does that seem like the best way to go about it? I mean, it doesn't to me.
Exactly. Yeah, I do find it fascinating that we do know based on very good research, the MMR, the measles part of the MMR works about 3 or 4 percentage points better if you get it when you're 15 months compared to when you get it at 12 months. Yet the government likes everyone to get it at 12 months, even though they're going to lose 3 to 4% efficacy. And I find that kind of strange. The U.S. government, anyway. What else? Let's see.
Well, they also talk about how multiple vaccines being given simultaneously, how that's a concern for the Japanese citizens.
It's very different in Japan.
And it says, but in Japan, multiple vaccines are less often given simultaneously than the United States. Okay, I'm just going to go back to the fact that we're talking about the world leader in health out of 191 countries. When you are ranking so well and you have so low levels of mortality for these types of cardiovascular diseases, and we know that they're being recognized as having longer life expectancy and good quality long life health, what are the patterns? We should be copying Japan. We should be copying their patterns, not them trying to look and see if they're keeping up with the United States, because there's a lot we're not doing right here. Like if I were looking at the Japanese, I'd say this is the number 1 world leader, number 2 in infant mortality in based on that 2000 to 2010 study. What are they doing right? Well, they don't believe in having so many at a time. They don't give so many so soon. Many are optional. When they see side effects, they take them off the market. They don't give them to children with fevers. This is the type of vaccination policy we should be adopting in the United States.
Right. So what else they don't do is again, this was back in 2014. I don't know if it's changed. They say there is no domestic legislation to enforce vaccination for children entering school in Japan. And it's funny that, sorry for laughing, the article says, talks about how bad that is.
Yeah, because it's a missed opportunity.
Right, it's a missed opportunity. Yet they don't stop and think, why is Japan so much healthier?
So one of the things they notice with Japanese people, it says some of these lower vaccination rates are because of parent attitudes. It says in one study, a third of mothers reported the intent to fully vaccinate. That's only a third, 33%. 50% only wanted to selectively vaccinate.
Right.
And then in another study, it's because they were worried about side effects, but also 10% were motivated to acquire natural resistance to some of these voluntary vaccine pathogens like chickenpox, because they are known to actually increase long life health in certain other ways. And this is something the Japanese people know, that not only do I not want to stop it, but I'd like my child to get this because this is going to keep them safer in the end. And so they follow that up with saying, people have a misperception of vaccines, even medical professionals. It says Japanese medical providers do not always have a basic knowledge, such as adverse effects, the intervals between times and things. And so they're saying, this comes back to the idea of education that you're saying, of what they want to indoctrinate them with certain education. But maybe these doctors do have the health knowledge, but the health knowledge they have just doesn't believe that we need to do so many doses for people to be healthy. So they're saying it as if these people don't have the knowledge, but maybe the knowledge that they do have is one on a whole body approach.
Right. But it's funny. They say there's even one study of Japanese resident physicians showed low vaccination rates for measles among the physicians themselves.
The doctors themselves,
And also fear of adverse events.
Right.
And lack of awareness of disease severity. Basically, these resident physicians felt like the diseases are not very severe,
right,
and there are adverse events to be considered. But this article almost states it as those are false reasons. Like those are like misperceptions.
It is, because this is totally based on the U.S. narrative. And they say on a political level, there has to be progress. In the United States, the ACIP is a federal committee that is composed of specialists, listen to this, who have no interest in pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
I love how they're, just the ACIP, totally neutral, totally independent, not connected to the CDC and those who have stakes in pharmaceutical companies, not connected to patents or any of that kind of stuff. We know that is false.
Yeah, but what just kills me, it says they say there is great hope for progress in as far as raising vaccine rates in Japan, and they kind of talk about what steps that are being taken to try to increase vaccination rates and increase the acceptance of all the newer vaccines.
Yeah, including financial incentives for primary care providers to vaccinate children and adults. This is a strategy that has been recommended in the United States for enhancing vaccination. They are telling you right away, you guys, for those who have questioned, do doctors, get bonuses on things like this, or does this is telling you there are financial incentives based on the United States, the way that they handle vaccines. There are financial incentives for primary care providers to vaccinate children. And so they're saying Japan should adopt the same thing. But this is such a great article, because I don't think that they intended to paint Japan in such a positive light, but by doing all these things, you really realize how well they were doing by doing things this way. Yeah,
but it's something that's a little concerning, and that is going to end up sort of really mimicking what the United States does, is they say right now in Japan, every municipal government provides its own vaccination information to citizens. So basically every big city or county government does its own job of information.
Which makes sense, right? That makes sense, because each locale is different and the people are different there. They want to make it universal.
But they also say we could also improve this by instituting mandatory vaccination for school.
Yeah,
in
right.
Japan.
They're encouraging all the things that we do here.
It's coming, Japan, and unfortunately, I don't know if you read that the Japanese made their own ACIP committee in 2013. Basically a committee of medical professionals to basically start making vaccine policy.
Well, and then we started to see a big jump. In 2014, they added varicella with chickenpox vaccine. In 2016, I forget what they added. We'll go over this on all those schedules. I went through all this. They started adding a lot more things to their schedule.
Right. And if you're just kind of curious, basically what Japan does in a nutshell, it's kind of, back then it was a little less, but now it's a little similar. But they do like the 3 infant doses of DTaP and polio and hepatitis B and Hib and pneumococcal vaccine. These are sort of like they do like the same 3 infant doses that we do, and then they do a booster dose later. But some of these they don't start till 3 months. Some of them don't start till 2 months. They don't advise a birth dose of hepatitis B vaccine.
Which in the top 5 countries with the lowest infant mortality rate, none of them had birth doses.
Right. They do the measles and rubella at 1 and 5 years. They do chickenpox at 1 year and 18 months. One thing Japan does, and again, some of these are optional, some of these are kind of more promoted, but one thing Japan does, they don't give the tuberculosis vaccine until 1 year of age. Most of the Asian countries give it at birth. The day a baby's born, you get a tuberculosis vaccine. Japan waits till the kids are 1. The other thing Japan does is they don't give a whooping cough booster later. They don't give the 5-year-old whooping cough booster or the 12-year-old whooping cough booster like we do. They just give a tetanus booster at 12. They do a number of things differently. But again, they are moving more towards our system. So it's going to be interesting, 10, 20 years from now, what is the Japanese infant mortality going to be and their child mortality? What's it going to be like? I think we need to keep an eye on that. I'll add that to my list of podcasts 10 years from now that I hope Melissa will be here for. And
no, because I looked through Japan, and I think I even sent you a message like their schedule has almost doubled I think, is what I wrote you in the last 10 years of what they're now adding onto it from what it was. Yeah. It's getting closer. I think it's now not doubled, but 37 doses, I think, is what is on their schedule now. It used to be 25. I think it's somewhere around there. Okay. But we'll talk about this on the global thing because there's absolutely been a difference since 2014. It's gone up, and I've seen, and then there's been a decrease in their high ranking on infant mortality. It's now gotten lower, which means there might be direct correlations to the fact that they've increased the schedule in the way that they have.
Yeah, so I don't know, I just kind of thought this was an interesting. Again, this article, by the way, was written by two Hawaiian health professionals, because they get a lot of immigrants from Japan that move to Hawaii, and they wanted to be able to kind of understand the Japanese approach to vaccination so that Hawaiian physicians could kind of understand where these families have come from.
I feel like we should be using this as a model. Right, honestly, the way that they approach this whole entire vaccine program, I feel like should be the model for developed countries worldwide. Right.
Exactly how they used to approach it.
Yeah, they used to in 2014. Yeah,
they are again more and more influenced by.
It's got to be pharmaceutical companies pharmaceutical companies in the United States are really looking at a global initiative.
Right, and they work with the World Health Organizations, and they help countries create their own CDC programs and their own ACIP, immunization policy maker boards. They help countries create these, and then, but again, I think, I don't think they're being purposely nefarious. I think these medical professionals really do equate higher vaccination rates with better health outcomes for a country. They actually think they're doing
Which
good.
ones?
I think the medical professionals.
Which ones?
Involved in these programs.
You're talking about in the big global programs?
Yeah. I think a lot of them
because
actually
the medical
think
professionals,
it's better to vaccinate. The more you vaccinate, the better and healthier you are. Even though they don't have the data for that, that's just the perception.
So how are you a medical professional without looking at data, though?
And it's kind of, people call it a religious thing.
I mean, I feel
kind of a religion where
the medical professionals in Japan, they obviously didn't see the need for that.
I know they didn't used to see it that way.
But they're medical professionals also.
Right. So I wonder if there'll be resistance. I wonder if they'll
I just feel like there's too much influence, too many lobbyists that pushing in a pharmaceutical agenda personally is what it feels like to me, because this is a global idea. This is a universal concept of get every country on board, every state on board. This is not individualized at all. It's supposed to be just one, one big program. Yeah.
Well, that was that's interesting. Thank you for bringing that article to light, and kind of gave me some things to think about. And I don't know if there's anyone listening in other countries, and we do know there's some European listeners, and I don't know if we have any listeners in Japan, but if you are and you have any sort of
I would love to hear some input. Yeah, I would hear some input on this.
Send us a comment.
Yeah, what is family life there? What is the approach to disease? What do parents and grandparents think about these common childhood diseases and the need to stop them? I would love to get some input. If anybody has family in Japan or are living in Japan listening to this, please send us a message on Immunity Education Group. I would love to talk about this directly from people who are involved in it. Yeah. We need to announce the day that we're going to do the live Q&A Facebook episode.
Yeah. So let's do that on the next episode, and we'll figure out what day that's going to be, and then we got to pick a day.
Okay. Bye, listeners. Thank you so much.
Let's keep it rolling, and you and I can pick a day right now. All right.
Well, let's pick a day. I mean, let's do this. But synchronize your calendar.
I know. What are you doing? Let's see. I can't do it Saturday the 30th.
Does it have to be a Saturday, right?
Do you want to do a Saturday?
Sure. Let's do the 6th, April 6th.
Okay. Maybe April 6th,
Facebook 9
o'clock a.m.
Okay. Facebook, sure.
Yeah, okay.
9 o'clock a.m., Facebook Live, April 6th. We're going to do a full hour of Q&A. Are we going to podcast it?
Yeah. Live Facebook. Yeah, Facebook Live. Oh, yeah. Facebook Live and podcast.
So we're going to have a separate thing that we can actually look at people's, so we can have one of our phones for the camera and then have something we can actually read their stuff. Yeah. Okay.
But join us. Yeah. So join us April 6th,
9 a.m.
Saturday, 9 a.m. for Facebook Live. And we have to clarify that the Facebook Live will be on the Immunity Education Group Facebook page, not Melissa's page, because the last one we did was on your page. Personal page. This will be on the Immunity Education Group Facebook page, so find us there. It'll be at 9 a.m. Pacific time. I got to specify that, right? ask us, anything that's been, on your mind that you want us to talk for, 5 minutes on, and we'll just go through all the questions. And
okay, we were not going to be able to answer everybody's questions. I just want you to know.
Will.
No, we will
I
not.
will stay until.
Yeah, right.
Until.
No, it's hard. Sometimes all the questions come pouring in kind of at once. So make sure it's something that's really, now, it doesn't have to be like disease related. It could totally be like, hey, Dr. Bob, what was your feeling when this happened, or whatever, or it could be, Melissa,
personal questions.
How do you get your bangs so straight? Or we're here to be available to you, to socialize with you guys and to connect with you, and in a way that we can't do live on podcasts as easily. So we'll try to incorporate this every now and then, that we can do something like this for you guys too. So April 6th, mark it down in your calendars. Cool. We're signing off. All right, and thank you guys for listening to the Vaccine Conversation. Yes. And we will see you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.